So we're going to get started this morning. My apologies for not being able to put my camera on. For some reason, I can't select that option. Please let me know if you can't hear me at any point. But a general welcome, a warm welcome to everyone this morning. Thank you for bearing with us whilst we got up and started. I want to introduce myself. I am Sheridan Selman. I work with the Institute for Economic Justice as a researcher and special projects lead, and over the last year have focused on industrial policy work, and it's been a great delight to work with the master plans research aimed at supporting COSATU's participation in the master plan negotiation process. And that's in a selection of master plans, including cannabis. We're launching a research report this morning, and we are really excited about the work that's been done by Katrina and Andrew. I will introduce them after Tony has spoken, but I just want to extend huge thanks to the International Labour Organization that have funded this work in conjunction with the University of Edinburgh's Research Support Fund. Thank you also to the interviewees. Without your participation, it wouldn't have been the report that it is, and you really helped us to gain some key insights. Thank you to COSATU, as always, for your moment's readiness to support the work that we're doing, to participate, to learn, to have some robust engagements. And thank you to the DTIC, not only for your role in the master plans process, but in commissioning new important research in the sector. And so it's fantastic to see development and a commitment to the industrialization of the sector. And we welcome the research that is coming up. How we will proceed today is Comrade Tony Ehrenreich from COSATU will open the program for us. And then I will hand over to Katrina and Andrew to conduct their presentation. And they will be followed by responses from Garth and from Ayanda. I will introduce each of them. And so don't worry about that too much for now. But I would like to start by reminding you that this launch is being recorded. And so don't get a fright about that. And I want to warmly welcome Comrade Tony to open the launch for us. He's been a member of COSATU for more than 3 decades now, and he's currently Deputy Parliamentary Officer for COSATU. Tony cut his teeth in the trade union movement, and he became National Deputy General Secretary 10 years later. He went on to hold various positions, including representing the organization at a variety of international labor bodies and convenings. And I see that Tony is described in the popular press as No Bling Tony, and his office as Spartan, otherwise described as not a lover of things. He is a supporter of mixed income housing and believes that the foremost responsibility of government is to prioritize the needs of the poor. This signifies that we are in good company. Thank you so much for agreeing to open the launch for us today, Comrade Tony. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Cheryl, and I hope you don't mind that I leave my camera off because my connection is not great, so I don't want to compromise our discussions in any way. Let me start by echoing your support for the thanks to many of the colleagues and institutions who've been assisting us in putting in place the master plans, but particularly to you, Cheryl, and to the IEJ. The IEJ has been central in supporting COSATU and labor generally in South Africa to help us to both prepare and codify our ambitions for the master plan, but also to assist Sorry, Cheryl, can you hear me now? Because the line just closed.
You disappeared there for a while, Comrade Tony.
All right, I'm so sorry about that. Not sure what happens, but I'll continue then.
Thank you.
I suppose our point is that what we want to ensure is that we have evidence-based policy, and the master plans provide us with an excellent opportunity to do that. Of course, this poses a challenge to the trade union movement, who in many areas have lost significant amount of capacity to do the research and position us to engage in these new areas of discussion. But because it's such a central part of democratizing the economy ensuring that there's greater levels of inclusion, and responding to the huge curse of unemployment in our country. We think that it's an essential part of policymaking, and we want to thank all our colleagues who assist us in developing our positions and ambitions for going forward. All comments that we've received thus far within the labor movement is that this is certainly an exceptional research paper. And so we want to thank the drafters for it. We want to thank everybody involved, because it certainly puts us as labor in a really favorable position to get the discussions going, to put some pegs into the ground, to mark our ambitions, and to say unambiguously what it is that we want to see from government policy, especially in the context of a commitment towards a developmental state that is meant to help those who are the most marginalized in our society, and for us to more broadly undo many of the legacy questions. When looking at any industrial policy in any of the sectors in South Africa, our horrors of the past must be avoided in the future. We know that we've set up amazing new industries. The platinum industry is one of that, a big earner of foreign exchange, lots of exports built around that. But one of the weaknesses is that we don't have a clear industrial strategy for platinum. We have not set in place the value chains. We have not moved up the value chain to ensure that we are able to put in place research and industrial capacity abilities to be able to add more value to it. And so we've lost significant opportunities. In the platinum industry, with its knock-on effects related to Marikana and others, we've seen now that failure of a coherent industrial strategy takes an important resource of our country and actually just feeds into the pipelines of poverty that comes about in many of our communities. We want to avoid that by all means in respect of cannabis, and the changes that are coming about now, including the markers that we're putting in place in respect of what this policy must achieve, is absolutely essential. The one sad thing about the legislative changes that have come in place now is that it has been incredibly slow. It seems by a government that has not prioritized it, and just the moves from the first point of contact around the private members bill that obligated us to change our approach towards cannabis, how it's regulated and how we respond to it, have seen slow movement in taking up the opportunities. Now, that slow movement in many respects has denied us the opportunity to put in place a clear industrial strategy that evaluates the value chains and looks at all areas of it, whether it's industrial cannabis, medical cannabis, the adult cannabis industry in South Africa, as well as many of the sections of international laws and treaties that undermine in many respects our sovereign ability to ensure that industries speak to our most urgent needs, and where we start to undo some of the prejudices that had informed certainly the codification of many of those treaties that still present many challenges to important industries today. Some of the threats that we see able to come out of this is that we're going to lose the opportunity in relation to other growers. Many other countries are moving much faster in putting in place a legislative environment which is positioning them ahead of us in the curve towards putting in place the industrial capacity and all of the associated developments in those industries. That means we move losing important opportunities for foreign earning. Its impact on GDP is denied. The job opportunities that can come out of that is lost. The formalization of many of the traditional growers is further delayed. Our ability to add value and get research and development going in the industry with coherent investment, that's also lost. So all of these delays does not help us to get to the point where we can maximize the potential benefits of this important new industry. We've got to make sure that as we craft together what the ambitions of labor is, and the paper goes a long way towards doing that, we're able to respond to both environmental questions as well as the matters related to the decent work agenda. Here, an added imperative must be the whole principle of fair trade, and how are we able to ensure that the circumstances and the conditions under which growing takes place, its value add and processing, that all of that happens under fair trade conditions, and that we're able to build an industrial sector that's in line with our ambitions for decent work, moving up the value chain and creating more job opportunities. But for us to do that, we've got to carefully evaluate the vested interest of the corporate entities within this important industry, as well as the traditional growers. And the paper speaks to a number of special considerations to ensure that we can defend the traditional growers, because the income from cannabis in those traditional growing communities had been a significant contributor to their lifestyle and livelihoods, and we must ensure that we sustain that. Not losing traditional growers and traditional jobs for corporate interest that really undermines many of the possibilities. There are a few areas that we'd want to ask that we look at in a bit more detail in the research. We like the fact that you highlight the challenges of public health, the challenges of potentially criminal justice issues. And here, many young men and women have had their lives thrown in complete disarray because they may have been caught with a joint, and because of that has a criminal record that have debilitating effects on their possibilities for their lives. And so we've got to change that. We've got to be mindful of the fact that a lot of the illicit activities in the way that it's structured at the moment, where gangs have come in and managed and control part of the prohibition around it and used it as an opportunity to fund many of the other criminal activities, that must be reflected on in a bit more detail, because those are profound social injuries in our communities, and we must respond to that in a creative way. We'd also ask that we in some way can reflect on undoing some of the stigma in the industry. The parallels between alcohol and cannabis has got to be explored in more detail, especially those that talk about the social damage that alcohol causes in our communities, whether it's in healthcare or gender-based violence or motor car accidents, as opposed to the damage caused by a facility like cannabis. So that comparisons must be made so that we can start talking to communities and breaking down unjustifiable stigma and finding new ways to ensure that this industry is able to take its place in our society without the undoings. So, Chair, we want to make sure that the question of domestic markets and the ability around adult use there, including being mindful of the relative health benefits and health challenges. We've got to do comparisons between the dangers of cigarette smoking as opposed to cannabis smoking. And we've got to ensure that the regulations that we have in place now with alcohol and cigarettes to ensure we avoid underage uses or some of the health challenges around that is clearly communicated. We think we've got quite a good practice in South Africa, and we must expand that into other areas. So as I conclude, I want to say that the research that's done in this paper has been absolutely enlightening. I think it's going to go a long way towards both positioning COSATU and the labor movement to engage on these issues, but also for us to demand a more expedited process. We, with all these great intentions that we have lost many opportunities because we've just been too tardy on moving to implementation. We want to, in the process of the master plan discussions, ensure that both the content, the subject, and the detail that the paper provide, that is supported and complemented by a clear implementation strategy that ensures that we have progress sooner than later, and we have the benefits of these important industry going into the future. So with that, I want to, on behalf of Labour, thank the IAJ, thank the contributors to the paper, and thank our colleagues from both government and business as we look forward to using this as the basis for deepening our collaboration and ensuring that we build an industry that achieves and supports the key social objectives that we've set for ourselves. Thank you very much, Cheryl.
Thank you, Comrade Tony. And thank you for highlighting the intricacies and the complexities of the sector. I think that is a key challenge to grapple with. And it is very encouraging to have people like Mr. Garth Strachan, who'll be a respondent later, in the space on the part of government, and to also from a COSATU perspective, to clearly articulate Labour's needs in this space. Getting the sector right is crucial. And so it requires our best efforts and working together. It is now my pleasure to introduce our researchers and authors to you this morning. They've both treated this work with great care and with humility, and both extended themselves well beyond the available budget and the time allowances to produce what I see as a passion piece And we're really very grateful for that. They've also both been careful to acknowledge the limitations of this publication. So there are other publications being produced, research work in the area, dealing with some similar topics, some different topics, but they are careful to acknowledge the other researchers in the arena who are also doing really good work. Our first presenter is Ms. Katrina Lehmann-Grube. Katrina worked at the IEJ just before I joined, and so I'm so delighted that our paths have crossed now, even if they didn't then. Katrina is an associate researcher on climate change and inequality at the Southern Centre for Inequality Studies at WITS. Katrina is also a PhD student. She has registered for a PhD at the Environmental Humanities South Institute at UCT, and she's focusing on climate change and land injustice. She previously worked as the climate justice researcher at the IEJ, where she worked on just transitions, focusing on agriculture and land and supporting work on the cannabis master plan research. She worked in a range of roles at the intersection of the environment and social justice, including at the Wild Law Institute and the Independent Redress Mechanism of the Green Climate Fund. She holds a BSc from UCT and an MSc from SOAS, University of London. The second presenter is Dr. Andrew Bowman. Andrew is a lecturer in international development in the School of Social and Political Science at the University of Edinburgh. He's also a research associate at the Society Work and Politics Institute, otherwise known as SWAP, at the University of the Witwatersrand, and he's senior research associate in the Department of Sociology at Rhodes University. So clearly a committed academic. He researches the political economy of natural resource-based development with a focus on agri-food and extractive industries, and his recent work has particularly focused on the challenges for small enterprises in agro-processing value chains. Welcome to you both. Please go ahead with your presentation.
Thanks so much, Sherilyn, for that introduction. And thanks, Pam, for helping us with the screen sharing today. So good morning to everyone, and thank you so much for joining. And thank you to Sherilyn and Tony for opening the session today. We're really pleased that so many of you could attend, and we really hope that you'll find this report useful. I'd like to thank Andrew in particular for spearheading this report, and also those who we interviewed as part of the process who were willing to share their time and expertise with us, some of whom are here today. So we are going to give a brief overview of some of the major points of the report, some of which Tony has already alluded to. But for those interested in more detail, we encourage you to go through the report yourselves, as obviously we're unable to cover everything in detail today. So as was originally mentioned, this report really came out of a process of research support that the IEJ was providing for COSATU, or together with COSATU. But we quickly realized that there was actually very limited information available for this emerging industry. And this initiated a more detailed process in 2021, which included interviews with various stakeholders, in addition to the desktop research we were conducting. The work was then continued by Andrew independently into 2022. And basically what we wanted to achieve with this report was twofold, relating specifically to the South African context. One was how to achieve forms of industrial growth and international competitiveness that can create decent work. And two, how to build an inclusive cannabis economy in which traditional cannabis growers and small enterprise can participate. So although we had somewhat ambitious aims, or these are somewhat ambitious aims, this report is really exploratory and quite tentative in nature. And there are a lot of other challenges, important challenges that were beyond the scope of what we could achieve. So these were things like fiscal policy, criminal and social justice, public health, and all of these issues have a bearing on the industry and also on the findings of this report. Next slide, please. Thanks. So just for a little bit of global context, we are currently seeing a massive shift in cannabis regulation and the emergence of a legal globalized cannabis industry. So this is happening at national levels, for example, like in South Africa, but also internationally. So in 2020, the UN Commission on Narcotic Drugs rescheduled cannabis, removing it from the Schedule 4 list of the most dangerous drugs with no therapeutic value. This shift has been attributed to a variety of things. So this has included things like the changing scientific opinions about its medical use and harm or lack thereof, shifts in political opinion about the failures of prohibition, recognition of its economic potential in terms of jobs and tax revenue, and its industrial uses to replace more environmentally damaging materials, or for things like carbon sequestration and remediating soils. In some contexts, there have also been important advocacy movements, which have also played an important role in this shift. This has resulted in the growth of an international legal cannabis market, providing new export opportunities for countries like South Africa that have good conditions for cultivation. Next slide, please. So as with global trends, South Africa's also seen some significant policy shifts. We've always had a very large domestic market, both in terms of production and consumption in South Africa. But after the Constitutional Court ruling in 2018, private use and small amounts of cultivation have been allowed, and the Cannabis for Private Purposes Bill was initiated and is currently making its way through Parliament. Though there has been research on hemp in South Africa for decades, it remains a very nascent industry, with the licensing system only introduced in 2021, which recognized it as an agricultural crop and allowing for permits to grow cannabis below the 0.2% THC threshold. On the medical side of things, cannabis was rescheduled in 2018 under the Medicines Act, basically allowing for high THC prescriptions and low CBD sale. Next slide, please. So in this context, we've tried to identify the 5 main challenges to the development of this industry in South Africa. The first is establishing a competitive position in global cannabis markets, particularly in the medical market. As one might expect for medical products, there are extremely high standards for medical production, and licensing is complex, costly, and very time-consuming. So SAHPRA certification, which is the local medical licensing, is not recognized globally, which means that on top of the complexities of local licensing, there is a whole additional set of requirements to be able to export. And this access to this international market is really important at the moment, as the local medical market is so small. The second key challenge is a longer-term one, which is the need to avoid the commodity trap. As Tony mentioned, there are lots of other nations seeking to become major medical cannabis exporters, and prices have been dropping. There's a longer-term risk to producing undifferentiated commoditized products, which are subject to downward pressure on prices. This can in turn lead to pressure on wages and working conditions. This leads me to the third point, which is the need for social and environmental upgrading. So in order for the industry to meet its developmental potential, it needs to center decent work and sustainability, both of which have been major issues in the country. Indoor production particularly has a very high ecological footprint, largely due to the energy needs of the lights. And poor working conditions and industrial relations problems have long been associated with horticulture and viticulture, which need to be avoided in this industry. The fourth point is the need for the creation of an inclusive cannabis industry with opportunities for traditional growers and small enterprise. Already, the livelihoods of traditional growers has been threatened by the decriminalization that has occurred, as essentially the bottom of their market has dropped out. Currently, the barriers to legal production in the medical industry are insurmountable. And this means that there's a risk that the industry becomes another site of corporate capture and consolidation, leaving those historically in the industry behind. And then one last point, there is a need to leverage domestic demand. In medical, the export market is extremely difficult to access, but there's only a really small legal domestic medical market, as there are no registered cannabis medicines, and therefore the process for getting it prescribed is difficult and complex. While there's a massive domestic adult use market, this remains criminalized. Next slide, please. So really the first step that we see in addressing these challenges is the establishment and legalization of a regulated adult use market. It is widely agreed that there are significant social harms from continued prohibition, including the criminalization of users, particularly from low-income households. This is also the key area for commercial growth opportunities, as it is by far the largest domestic market and the most accessible for traditional growers and small enterprises due to the high barriers to entry in medical. It also allows or provides for important opportunities for product differentiation and more segmented markets, which can provide niche opportunities for small business. Adult use legalization will require some regulation to balance social, commercial, and public health imperatives. This would include things like age limits, limits on advertising, as well as regulation that is supportive to traditional growers. While we see that some regulation such as this is absolutely necessary, it is important that it doesn't become too strict, because as other contexts have shown, this results in the persistence of an illegal market and barriers to entry for small-scale growers. Ultimately, the current Cannabis for Private Purposes Bill, we feel, is both inadequate and potentially harmful. If the industry is to meet its economic objectives, the first thing we need is clarity on the legal and regulatory framework. I'll now pass over to Andrew. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Katrina, and hi, everyone. So I'm going to continue the presentation and run through some of the other core areas that we identified for focus of interventions. And I guess, this is such a complex industry, cannabis, with so many challenges, that this is far from an exhaustive list, but I think does highlight some of the issues we felt were somewhat overlooked in the most recent iteration of the Cannabis Master Plan. So the first of these then that I wanted to highlight was addressing challenges in the licensing system. So as Katrina mentioned, it's become possible to produce hemp and medical cannabis legally under licenses over the last few years. The issue is that these licenses are extremely difficult to obtain in terms of the cost, in terms of the investment required, in terms of the complexity of the conditions. And from our interviews, we found even for large producers with very deep pockets coming from commercial agribusiness, it was very difficult to get hold of licenses because of this cost and complexity. And so for small enterprises and traditional growers, this creates major barriers to entry. So we feel there's an urgent need to address the licensing system and look at how it might be made more accessible to small enterprise and traditional growers. One potential avenue for doing this is through exploring forms of tiered licensing. So at the moment for hemp and medical production, you essentially just have one form of license available for each of the categories, cultivation or processing or whatever. And in other jurisdictions that we read about during the course of the research, there have been attempts to introduce tiered licenses where you have specific forms of licensing available to small enterprises or marginalized groups that enable them to enter the formal sector. And this is with the aim of not simply making it easier to enter, but also as a way of channeling support to cultivators or other businesses in the value chain that need it. So Jamaica is an example where the government have sought to do this, but also in many of the states in the United States that have allowed a legal adult use and medical cannabis market to emerge. There are social equity licenses where businesses are able to access mentoring and financial support as part of licenses that are easier to access. So we think these are some of the kind of policies which might need to be explored to address these kind of major obstacles that the licensing system presents. Next slide, please. Okay, a key short-term challenge we see is improving international market access. As Katrina mentioned, there is a growing global market for medical cannabis and the emergence of a global value chain for medical cannabis, which provides potential opportunities for job creation and industrial development. But the issue is that we found exporters or those seeking to export medical cannabis face major challenges with export market access. There are the difficulties with the licensing system domestically, but at international level, what you have is this kind of complex legal patchwork where different importing nations have different rules, regulations, certification requirements, etc., which makes it extremely complicated for prospective exporters. And there are particular challenges that we were identified with the European Union's good manufacturing practice. So this adds to all the kind of transaction costs that producers face, but it also creates major bargaining power imbalances with international buyers. So the people further up the value chain, manufacturers, distributors, etc., that South African cannabis cultivators are selling to. And we think there's a need to try and address this in order to realize the growth potential, the job creation potential. And some of the ways that might attempt to do this is firstly providing some basic market access support for prospective exporters. So advice on trade regulations, training to help exporters navigate this complexity, but more than this, to try and represent the interests of exporters in international markets and lobby for better access. One of the issues, as Katrina mentioned, is that there's not a mutual recognition in place for the SAPRA good manufacturing practice licenses, which domestic cultivators have to get. So they're in a situation of once they've secured their domestic license, that's not enough then to get them into their key export markets. So they have to then go and get another round of licenses. So that's not the case everywhere. Lots of other countries internationally have mutual recognition agreements between their licensing agencies, which eases market access. And that might be an important issue to explore. And then finally, there's also key bottlenecks which came up through the interviews, things like laboratory access or the lack thereof, and the time delays in securing key permits and paperwork. Next slide, please. So that's the short-term issue of just gaining access to international markets. But in the longer term, there's the challenge of economic upgrading in the cannabis industry into higher value-added products if the job creation is going to be stable and conducive to the production of decent work. So as Katrina mentioned, lots of other nations worldwide are trying to enter export markets for cannabis, and we came across a lot of concerns about intensifying price competition and falling wholesale prices. And I suppose in the longer term, this creates the risk of the kind of race to the bottom dynamics that you see in a lot of other agri-food commodities, where you get downward pressure on prices or price volatility that puts pressure on wages and working conditions and on environmental conditions as producers seek to compete by lowering them. And I guess that's something that longer term there should be a strategic effort to avoid. So we see a need to support innovation activities in the cannabis sector and support upgrading into higher value-added products within cannabis, which are not subject to these same kind of competitive dynamics. And so what do we kind of mean with this? This is downstream value-added products. So manufactured products made from cannabis are very important, and there are firms within the South African cannabis economy that are attempting to do this in various different product categories. But the research also highlighted to us the kind of neglected importance of horizontal linkages in the value chain. So that is the supply of equipment and machinery to cannabis processing. There are potentially important opportunities for localization, which could be explored through the master plan process, and which could have the potential to create industrial jobs adjacent to cannabis. Input supply as well. So cannabis production relies on a range of different inputs, and it's important to look at where they're coming from. And then finally, also from the interviews, you see genetics as being likely very central to value capture in the future of the cannabis industry. So there's a need to support innovation activities in genetics. This would require new institutions for coordinating a sectoral innovation system. So there's already a lot of innovative activity going on amongst South African firms in the cannabis sector and amongst research organizations in the South African economy. So universities, but also public research institutions, the ARC, the CSIR. And I suppose the issue we felt was there's a need for coordination among them. To try and pull these things together. And so longer term, the formation of a kind of state cannabis agency that can play this role and also help build expertise within the state, but also effective industry associations as well, as a way of coordinating within the private sector and mobilizing resources. These have been quite important in other successful export commodities. But there would be a need to ensure that such agencies are representative and inclusive of all interests within the sector rather than simply the bigger producers. Next slide, please. Okay, for hemp, we've been talking quite a lot essentially around issues in the medical cannabis value chain. For hemp, we felt some of the challenges were slightly different. In particular, there was a major concern amongst a lot of interviewees about, there's a lot of focus on hemp supply, getting people to grow, but who are the crops going to be sold to ultimately? And I guess, as with many young industries, there's this kind of chicken and egg problem going on. So you can see there's a need to focus on generating demand for hemp production, not just on increasing supply. So looking at international experiences of kind of more advanced hemp producing nations, proximity to processing capacity is quite important, it seems, for hemp cultivation. And the kind of gaps in processing capacity have been key hindrances on the growth of hemp production in the United States and Canada over previous years. And there were a lot of concerns about the lack of processing capacity in South Africa in the hemp value chain, and a need to address this as a key early task. But perhaps more fundamentally than this, we thought, is that the need to address end market demand for hemp products. Hemp has a huge range of potential uses in food, as an industrial input. It's used in kind of composite materials that are used in the car industry. It can be used as a building material as well, and potentially has all kinds of environmental benefits within these applications as a substitute for environmentally harmful materials like oil-based plastics and cement. So there's a huge range of potential applications, but in many cases, these are very nascent, very early stage embryonic applications, which don't have a large market for producers to sell into. So there's a need to try and build this market to focus policy attention on how to increase the demand for hemp products. And these potential environmental benefits provide a rationale for these demand-driven industrial policies. So thinking, for example, about how public procurement might be used, thinking about whether within the private sector incentives can be given for substitutions of existing materials for hemp-based materials. We thought that this, while there's a lot of potential, this all requires further research to determine, where the environmental and economic additionalities from hemp are strong enough to kind of legitimize this kind of support. And there's a need for research in that area, we felt. Okay, next slide. Okay, so then another area we felt has been somewhat neglected within the master plan process in the last draft was issues around environmental sustainability and decent work. So we see there's a need alongside this economic upgrading into higher value added products, also focus on social and environmental upgrading. So how to improve standards for labor and communities, and how to limit the environmental footprint of cannabis production. And I think this is a concern because, as Katrina mentioned, particularly indoor cannabis cultivation has quite a large environmental footprint potentially, and because of all the other problems around labor that have been experienced in other subsectors of South African horticulture. So it's intrinsically important to address these if the developmental potential of cannabis is to be realized. But there's also good instrumental reasons for the industry to take these issues seriously. So from the research, we identified that supply chain ethics and sustainability are anticipated to be increasingly big issues in major cannabis markets. And I guess, you've seen this kind of trend around ethical consumption playing out in so many other agri-food commodities. And it's considered likely to be a big feature of the cannabis industry. So developing a reputation internationally for these high levels of working conditions and sustainability is going to be important for the industry as well. This is obviously a collective action problem for the industry. So, there's always the risk of less scrupulous producers undercutting others with lower labor and environmental standards. So it requires collective solutions. And we felt that there should be some consideration of, in early stages, an industry charter or certification scheme for labor and environmental standards in cannabis production that seeks to go above legal minimums. And in the longer term, perhaps looking at how licensing can be used as a way of cementing higher labor and environmental standards in the industry. So at the moment, that's not a particular feature of the licensing conditions, but perhaps licensing can be used more creatively in future. Within this, there's a need, we thought, for bringing all stakeholders together, multi-stakeholder government, so including labor and organized labor and communities within these discussions about how to improve social and environmental conditions within the industry. Next slide, please. Okay, and then the final one then, supporting traditional growers and small enterprises. I suppose a lot of the public discourse over the period we've been doing this work about the transition to legal cannabis markets is focused on the opportunities that this brings, and there are many, but it's important to bear in mind, we thought that for a lot of the traditional growers that have been supplying the illegal cannabis market for a long time, the transition to legal markets also potentially represents a threat if it's not regulated in their interests. So exposing them to competition with large agribusinesses that have a lot more capital to invest in the sector, there's a lot of threats for them. And as Katrina mentioned, this was from our interviews, the suggestion was that, and from other research being done on this part of the value chain, that decriminalization has already affected traditional growers quite negatively. So there's a need for targeted support to help traditional growers participate in the formal sector. So support for improved infrastructure, access to capital, and particularly market access. So creating systems which help traditional growers link to the value chain. So there's been a lot of good ideas created around this by other organizations that, for example, that have been working on this challenge for longer than we have. So downstream agencies that aggregate the production of traditional growers, lots of small scale producers, which assist with processing, assist with the challenges of quality control, and also channel support back to farmers. So these could be funded by the state, or they could be run as cooperatives or producer associations, but creating that first link in the value chain to help producers enter markets is important. Landrace cannabis varieties, kind of indigenous cannabis varieties that are prevalent in many of the traditional grower areas are a key potential asset. There's a lot of hunger within the international cannabis industry for new genetic material that may have different kinds of industrial or medical applications. And these landrace varieties potentially a very important asset within this, but they're at risk from bioprospecting, also contamination by other cannabis varieties. And we think there's an important need for research and measures to protect landrace varieties, to support specialization of traditional growers in potential niche product areas where they could have competitive advantages vis-a-vis the kind of big commercial producers, and also a need to consider measures within a kind of legal cannabis market to incentivize procurement from small producers and traditional growers. Okay, next slide, please. All right, in conclusion, so there are high expectations for cannabis as an inclusive development opportunity, and there is a lot of potential. However, we feel with the research that there are many big challenges to overcome, and echoing what Tony said there in the introduction, a need for urgency. There are major social and economic costs from the current legal and regulatory system, and there are opportunity costs as well, what could be going on in the absence of these blockages. And there are important early mover advantages internationally. A lot of other countries are trying to enter this space. We feel that the issues of decent work, inclusion, and sustainability need to be given a lot more emphasis within the policy processes, and that ultimately a lot more research is going to be required to support the effective targeting and policy design. So really, we're just kind of starting to scratch the surface here of this complex industry, and we're pleased to know that through the master plan process, there is this kind of deeper research now taking place. Okay, that's it from me.
Thank you so much, Katrina and Andrew, for your presentation. I know that there is a lot more detail in the publication itself that should be uploaded before we're done today. But I think some of the things I reappreciate again from your presentation are just the complexities involved in getting this industry to work and outlining the role of each of the stakeholders to realize that opportunity, I think really is very valuable. I imagine that there are many more recommendations to be made, but I think regulations that facilitate accessing export markets, allowing us to be able to have the lab access that are necessary, plans to develop economic upgrading, ensuring that we can localize aspects of production and ensure that we're creating work locally, but not only work, decent work, and ensuring that labor continues to be able to participate more meaningfully in industrial development. The urgency of commercializing adult use cannabis and all of what that is fraught with. Those are some of the things mulling in my mind, but we'll come to questions and answers later. I want to introduce now Mr. Garth Strachan. Garth is a consultant to the Project Management Office in the Presidency. Please note that he is not answerable for all questions government related. He is policy head responsible for hemp and cannabis sector development, and his role in the Presidency and Operation Vulindlela includes supporting sector coordination and the implementation of the master plan, with the aim of establishing South Africa in a globally competitive cannabis and hemp market. Before this role, Garth was DDG of Industrial Development at the DTIC. He was also former acting CEO of the South African Bureau of Standards, former board chairperson of Trade and Industrial Policy Studies, which is TIPS, former MEC of Finance and Economic Development in the Western Cape. And I understand that his favorite roles continue to be chief bottle washer and proud grandfather. Thank you so much, Garth, for making time to be here as a discussant. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Cheryl Lynn. Thank you for the opportunity. I just underline the fact that I don't have any executive positions, can't speak for government. I'm certainly not the head of policy in this role, and I'm simply providing consultancy services. It's a bit of an invidious position because inevitably you're in a situation where people require answers for government when government spokespersons may not be in the room. And in addition to that, I have got broad shoulders, and it's absolutely legitimate to criticize government, and I can take a beating, so to speak, so I'm not ducking any responsibility here. Secondly, just to echo the fact that I think it's an excellent document. In fact, when I was appointed, that was one of the first documents I read in draft, and it was of great assistance. My comments, I hope, won't echo too significantly what's said in the document. On a lighter note, some people may think, and just hold on to the metaphor here, that CBD stands for cannabinoid compound or central business district. A commentator in the US referring to the Federal Drug Administration coined the term chronic bureaucratic dysfunctionality as another use of the acronym CBD. And so it's important that civil society maximizes its pressure on government, but we have to recognize the realities in government itself, where there are 9 government departments. There's enormous knowledge and information asymmetry, scientific knowledge asymmetry. 9 departments need to get onto the same page for regulatory reform and economic strategy. There are incredible capacity problems. The Constitution demands transparency, fairness, and efficacy in regulation. I think that's a very big challenge that we face. And you know, in addition to that, They are sometimes very defensive, as I think has been alluded to, default positions referring to the UN Single Convention and so on and so forth. So the issue for me is how do we actually support government to develop the right knowledge base? I've even thinking now that we need whatever it is, a 20-page primer on the subject of hemp and cannabis. And we need training in government, we need agricultural extension training, and so on and so forth. So it's the first thing I want to say is government itself may be a barrier, and it's useful to throw stones at government, but we've actually got to think about ways in which we support government to address those critical complaints. And then the third point I want to make is sunrise sector development is incredibly difficult. I think it's even more difficult in this particular sector. As I said, we've got 9 departments, we've got multiple demand pathways in medical, human and animal consumption, industrial, cosmetics, and so on and so forth. And we need, as has been said, an evidence-based enabling regulation and so on and so forth. And so I personally am of the view that the master plan methodology is useful, but there's a tendency to use it as a rather mechanical methodology. We all know that there are multiple industrial policy instruments. They range from financing to incentives to SEZs, to tax incentives, to trade and tariff policy, to procurement support, to, you know, such a long list that I couldn't even go through it. And so I think the master plan approach has to define what are the key pragmatic industrial policy instruments that can be deployed in the sector, and the IJ study obviously points to those, and how do we get those deployed urgently and pragmatically. In the automotive master plan process, which I was involved in, it was much easier. We had one department, the DTRC, the National Treasury was involved in the financing issues, and we worked with NARCAM, NAMSA, and NUMSA, and it was easier. This is incredibly complex for all the reasons that I've summarized, but in addition to those. And so what am I trying to help with? The first thing is we need urgent regulatory reform in all the demand pathways. And I really like the view that we need tiered licensing. And, you know, we're trying to get urgent regulatory reform around the THC level, the CBD level. The fact that SAPRA is, I think, has got mandate creep and appears to be regulating the hemp plant. You know, my view is that SAPRA has a role to play in the regulation of registered and complementary medicines and the so-called pharmacy cannabis prescription model. But regulatory creep is a hugely important problem, especially in this area. And so we need urgent regulatory reform, and that's the first thing we're trying to do. And if you think it's a job for the faint-hearted, think again. Then obviously, as has been said, we need a value chain situational analysis and a country competitive strategy across, as Andrew has said, and Katrina and others have said, we're stuck in a resource trap and value addition isn't being captured. And that's a critical question. And sometimes in government, there's almost like a kind of anti-intellectual approach to this thing, just do it. but we can't compete across the value chain. Argentina has set aside $100 million for this effort. I don't want to say the amounts that I have access to, but they are infinitesimal in comparison. And then we've also appointed a team of researchers to do a financing model, private and public sector financing ecosystem. And then in the longer term, we obviously need a whole plant, all purposes set of policy principles and legislation, as has been said very often before. I think the liquor bill is not directly transferable, but is a useful example of how a product which has enormous economic and commercial benefits, but also social harms, is a model for the kind of thing that we should be doing in relation to hemp and cannabis. I'm not responsible for what is happening in Parliament in relation to the Cannabis for Private Purposes bill. I have my own views on the extent to which it is possible to put in place an enabling regulatory and legislative environment using that bill, but I won't, with respect, air those today. And then we need a much stronger scientific industrial research effort. The CSIR in the Department of Science and Innovation is doing interesting work, but it needs to be mapped. Who's doing the research in the public sector and the private sector? What is the research on, and how do we make it central to a sector development plan or so-called master plan? And then we need a medical scientific effort. Who's doing the medical research in the medical demand pathways? We can't simply rely on an evaluatory medical scientific effort, which says that SAPRA will evaluate a submission to raise the THC limit, for example, from 0.2 to 1%. Obviously, the private sector has a role to play in this, but we've got to initiate a much bigger medical scientific effort. We obviously need a standards and conformity assessment framework. And, you know, just to give you an example, the American ASTM standards body has, I think now 43 standards. We're trying to build a matrix of where the regulation falls across all the demand pathways. What are the standards and conformity assessment required in each of those demand pathways? Which government institution, supported by what private sector capabilities, exists for standards and conformity assessment? And then clearly the question of inclusive growth and the exclusion of traditional legacy farmers is a major problem. And under the rubric of urgent regulatory reform, we are trying to persuade both SAPRA and DELRAD that in inclusive models in relation to the permits and the licensing of SAPRA and financial support for these measures is absolutely urgent. As I think somebody said, I don't, as much as I would love to, have a magic wand. We need budget support for inclusive growth. And then lastly, there's a whole lot of adjacent research that needs to be done. I think Andrew pointed to the fact that of the hemp capabilities in relation to rehabilitation, remediation, carbon sequestration, accessing global financing, and that's hugely important. that piece of work needs to be done. And there are other adjacent research work that is required. I'm going to end off because my time has come to an end, just to make the point which I've made frequently before. Frontier data suggests that the existing use of electricity in Europe is the same as required to drive a medium-sized city in Europe. If that is paying nothing but lip service to carbon mitigation, then nothing is. And our advantage has to lie in outdoor growth. We need a strategy which is aligned to that, with standards and conformity assessment. And we should stop bowing at the altar of international conventions and methodologies and policy frameworks which are being adopted in developing countries. So indigenous knowledge and, for example, African traditional medicine has to be a demand pathway and an important competitive advantage. And we are trying to stress that as well. This is a very high level summary. Happy to take questions, or for that matter, most importantly and lastly, meet anybody in and outside government who thinks that they can add value in relation to policy development, to an economic evidence base, to regulatory reform, to low-hanging opportunities across the value chain, especially in midstream and end-user demand in the value chain, export opportunities, and so on and so forth. Thank you very much.
Garth, thank you so much for that. Your last comment stands out. The first time I ever heard you speak, you echoed that very same call, an invitation to players outside of the state who wanted to meet. And I think that is such an important mark in order to be able to move forward in terrain that is as complex as this. I do not envy your job, and I couldn't think of anybody better to be in this role. And so thank you so much for sharing those comments with us. Before I introduce our next discussant, I just want to remind you that the chat box is open for questions. So once Mr. Andrew Bowman is done with his presentation, with his discussion, we will open up the floor to questions and answers. So you're welcome to start placing questions in the chat box as we proceed to the point where we can open up the discussion. Mr. Andrew Bowman has probably led 3 or 4 lives in his short life to date. His CV is very easy to make one feel a little bit underaccomplished. So what I'm introducing now is a tiny slice of it, and we are in great company. Thank you, Ayanda, for joining us today. Ayanda is CEO and co-founder of Zageta, or RAB Holdings, which is South Africa's first indigenous cannabis holdings company, and has diversified interest across the industrial hemp value chain. He has extensive international experience in agriculture, water infrastructure, in energy. He also wears different hats in the cannabis and agricultural industries in South Africa, including as BUSA's nominated representative for the private sector on the National Cannabis Master Plan. He is president and co-founder of Friends of Hemp South Africa National Association, cannabis sector coordinator for the Public-Private Growth Initiative, and serves on various research and advisory boards. Ayanda is deeply passionate about the role of cannabis in transforming the socioeconomic landscape of the African continent. Thank you so much for your commitment to the development of the sector. I've been at the receiving end of that passion. We are grateful. Thank you for your presence here today. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Sherilyn, and to your team at IEJ. I hope I'm audible. So just to say, I hope I didn't come off as a little bit of a pompous arse. So my apologies if that's the first impression. But just to say, I think first and foremost, a big thank you to the team. Katrina and Andrew have really done a fantastic piece. This is probably one of the best pieces of literature in the South African cannabis industry that I've had the privilege of engaging with. It isn't the only one, but I think it was really fantastic in terms of focusing the attention really on sort of the bits and pieces of the industry that are really, really important to making this really a South African cannabis industry versus a copycat industry leveraging what happens elsewhere. But I'd also like to extend a thank you to COSATU and Comrade Tony, who I know has sort of been trying to charge on the labor side. It's been really fantastic to work with you and to collaborate. And I think this is a platform to do that. And then my final thanks just goes to all of the legacy and traditional farmers in South Africa who endow us with the heritage and the provenance that allows us to be able to have this kind of conversation today. I have only a couple of comments, and I think at risk of sort of repeating some of the things that Garth has mentioned and the presenters have through their paper, I'm going to focus on a couple of different things for a couple of minutes. So the first thing is really around the legislation, because it presents really the biggest obstacle at the moment for any kind of advancement, whether for traditional growers or for developing or commercializing any sort of pathways towards prosperity in the sector. I think we have used the international conventions as an excuse, frankly, because I'm not sure that we're going to be subjected to some sort of obligation to treaty, particularly in cases where, like for industrial hemp, it is not in any of the schedules of any of the international conventions that govern narcotics. It was so by design. In spite of South Africa's role in actually the criminalization globally of cannabis, I think we really need to take a really serious look at ourselves around what needs to change here. The major challenge and the obstacle is really government. I do get the issues around the knowledge asymmetries. A lot of discussions tend to end up being sort of lectures around cannabis and what it does. So for sure, the evidence base isn't there, but we cannot ignore the fact that over the last 50 years of the war on drugs, that South Africa has been one of the largest producers of cannabis globally, in spite of the racist and frankly unjustifiable prohibitions on this plant. So what we're talking about is not a legalization of cannabis, it's about a re-legalization. The anomaly is not the plant, the anomaly is the legislation itself. And unfortunately, when you have 9 government departments who all have some sort of hand in cannabis, who have not found any sort of meaningful way of being able to make sure they can build up their evidence base or can actually work together so that there's some sort of coherence across the different pieces of legislation, that's really been something that's missing. And I think fundamentally the centralization of power and the coordination and oversight has led to some very absurd situations where, I mean, I don't see how somebody who's sitting, in Mount Frere in the Eastern Cape who wants to grow hemp needs to get a permit that gets processed in Pretoria. I mean, this centralization nationally is really, really a big inhibitor. It's the reason why you have all of these complaints about how slow it is to get anything done. It takes 18 months, 24 months to be able to get a Section 22C. The first issuing of of permits for hemp, thankfully, which, those coming really off of the back of a threat of litigation from the private sector, and has yielded all of these amazing permits that you've got, but they get issued sort of 3 months before your preparations for the season. So nobody even has the ability to access the requisite inputs. That is a major, major challenge. I mean, on this front, we have done all sorts of things. I mean, I think Myrtle Clark is on here. They've produced a manifesto. They've been looking to protect the rights of individuals engaged here. There are many organizations, FOSA, CTAA, all of these folks who have been trying to work alongside government, but the intransigence is really extraordinary. And unfortunately, that's not something that we can help government with. This is something they really need to organize for themselves. I think beyond the legislation, I think there are sort of 2 ways of thinking about those, that there's sort of, on one side, the legislation that decriminalizes the plant as a whole. So a lot of these, when we think about legislation, we're thinking sort of SAPRA, we're thinking Department of Justice, we're thinking DELRAD. But actually, once we get over that hurdle, there are also all sorts of regulations that are going to need to be either developed or amended to accommodate all of these other different demand pathways. And those need to sit actually outside of those three main institutions that I've mentioned. And there's a little bit of a jostling of power that's actually happening among the departments. And that's something that I think a higher power needs to be able to resolve, because otherwise it makes government a really poor interlocutor in these kinds of discussions. Is very difficult. And I think fundamentally there's a lack of imagination, and we've sort of lost, in essence, I think, the confidence to be pioneering as South Africans. There are very few other markets that have actually looked at whole purpose, like all plant whole purpose decriminalization as we have. Yes, Uruguay is somewhat of a model, but there are limitations there, even in how government sort of has quite a bit of overreach even in distribution of cannabis. But there is a lack of imagination around being really leading the globe around how to do this properly, and to do it in a way that actually respects our heritage, that centralizes our heritage and our provenance, and looks at ways of being able to commercialize those. That's absolutely critical. But I think the second thing, which is I think what Garth has mentioned, is that the way in which I think the industrial policy has been approached has been very much from a supply side, which I suppose is not surprising given that the coordinating department here is one that deals with the cultivation only, or of the plant. But what we're really trying to drive here is a much more demand-driven kind of industrial policy development process here. As we've said, you can do all sorts of things with cannabis. You can use it for farming, for food, for feeds, for fibers, for fractions. And there are also lots of linkages to a variety of other pre-existing industries where we already have certain kinds of capabilities and infrastructure that actually can be leveraged to accelerate some of the development. But what's happened is we focus just simply on supply, and we're already running into a little bit of a big situation on sort of market rationalization. A simple example is, 5 years ago, if you were looking to get, for example, a liter of CBD oil, you could pay like 10 to 15,000 USD. Today, it's under $1,000. And that's in just a space of like 4 or 5 years. We have not really thought about what we're going to do once we have all of this material. And let's not forget, we're in South Africa, so the ability to actually produce cannabis is there. Yes, of course, there are areas where there needs to be upskilling, but we're not really going to have a problem with supply. The challenges are around accessing markets. And if you speak actually to traditional or legacy growers and a lot of small businesses that are looking to participate, they're actually asking from government really two things, right? One is create a legal and enabling environment in which to operate. Two, we want to be able to have access to a market. Beyond that, actually, they want to be left alone by government, frankly. But you need to be able to start from the demand side and work your way backwards to actually understand what really is feasible. For example, if we're looking at sort of automotive applications or textiles, right? There are various other drivers of change and actually market development and creation that are driven by the decarbonization or greening of industrial manufacturing, localization efforts, for example, or just simply the advantages that hemp as a feedstock actually provides over currently used materials. That demand actually exists. Folks are saying, well, we want to switch out of cotton, right? How are we able to do that? And what we have in South Africa is probably the ability to actually grow all of this stuff, right? So we'll have all of the supply. In fact, we already have an oversupply of hemp straw in South Africa. But unfortunately, there's no intermediation in the midstream area that actually allows you to transform the raw material into a usable form for your end markets. And there has been absolutely no consideration of this as at all. And this is an area where we need sort of the DTIC and the small business development to really play a much, much bigger role. It's not going to come out of the Department of Agriculture. Unfortunately, they don't see all of these various demand pathways. It's a similar thing in the automotive industry, where various biocomposites are used for making rear parcel trays or door lining or roofing, where you have companies that are situated in industrial clusters in South Africa that are actually importing the raw material, which has always been legal to do, by the way. It was just illegal to source the product from South Africa. Now that it is, we're not actually creating that linkage between those guys who are actually importing these mats, using them in the compression molding that's in making these car parts for folks like Mercedes-Benz, who are also driven by the need to actually decarbonize. So there are a number of linkages to a number of other sectors where we're not actually thinking smartly around, well, okay, yes, it takes a long time to build up a sunrise industry. Let's do this in incremental ways, but there actually are areas where we do have some comparative advantage that we can already leverage to try and accelerate that. So unfortunately, where we're sitting right now is that the industry is moving along, whether in the parallel market or folks figuring out loopholes. But if we continue along this path, we're going to have a major problem to deal with 5 years down the line when we're looking to rein all of these various behaviors and practices in. And I think the biggest opportunity cost is not actually thinking creatively about how you leverage, for example, procurement to try and create access to market for traditional growers, because it's not going to come through GMP. And certainly it's even absurd to us that the production of cannabis flower requires like good manufacturing practices for pharmaceutical products. I mean, it's completely absurd. The other thing that's really important is we are dealing with a situation where you have a very constrained fiscus, and we haven't really figured out the various financing mechanisms, because of course it's great to have all of these things, but who actually pays for them, right? And what are the various instruments that actually currently exist for other sectors that could be extended, but which are now prohibited because even certain organs of the state have legal opinions where it's very clear they cannot invest in parts of these because ultimately we're talking about an illegal substance. That's really important, especially in general in agriculture. There's a big discussion now around looking at de-risking mechanisms through, for example, blended finance options. I think those that can be leveraged, for example, to invest in new beneficiation models that don't see, traditional growers or small farmers as simply propertied proletariat to simply sort of supply into a market, as a way in which you can actually beneficiate this and leverage other things like our heritage on provenance and appellations. So, we are really sleeping, and that's going to be a really critical bit here. Government has not really made any major investment in the financing side, and we are getting left behind by countries that really are latecomers. We've been in the game for a very long time, but unfortunately, we're going to get left behind. Two last points from my side. One is I think there needs to be a greater discussion, and I'm really glad Katrina was part of this. So this lens around the contribution of cannabis to the just transition through decarbonization, improving soils, greenification of industrial manufacturing. There are potential carbon credits that can be earned for farmers to create like more additional or resilient alternative incomes, etc. That has not really had much of a place. And I think when we're thinking about an industrial policy that is really based on competitiveness, we actually need to start thinking about, well, what are the things that really endow us with the qualities of our cannabis, being able to grow outside, growing outdoor, these long maturing genetics, rather than these like 4-month maturation products with THC levels that are sky high, 30% plus. And frankly, we also have a worry about that kind of product landing on our markets, because there is no evidence that looks at the kind of the long-term public health effect of consuming THC levels that are that high. Our local cannabis is much lower than that, and it has all of these unbelievable contributions to the just transitions that we're not seeing, even in mining rehabilitation, for example, that Garth has mentioned. The final point I wanted to make was just around, when we're thinking about the protection of workers, it shouldn't just be about the protection of workers in the cannabis industry, because I can tell you there is big support from cannabis operators to actually compact, to also have a charter around ethics. Actually was something that was unfortunately stalled by the master plan process. but folks who are actually looking at very creative ways of figuring out how to actually make sure that they're held to like much higher standards and to accountability. But the worker I'm talking about is the one who consumes cannabis, for example. Maybe they've gotten it through a Section 21 option through SAPRA to get medicinal cannabis for their usage, but they go to work, they get tested, and they see very high levels of THC in the body, and THC metabolizes differently to alcohol. So its mere presence in the body does not actually equate to intoxication. But somebody like that who gets fired from their job and then looks to get some sort of recourse through the judiciary and through the labor court, which then edifies this absurdity and says, well, no, of course he can get fired because this is illegal under exactly the same sections of an act that the Constitutional Court 5 years ago said were unconstitutional, and for which there is no legal remedy like 5 years later. So those are also things that we need to start thinking about, because that's what's happening today. And I get numerous calls of folks who are going through this kind of situation, never mind the numerous folks who are illegally arrested continuously, right, for any kind of participation with cannabis. So those are really important points for me. But I want to say again, big congratulations to the team for putting this together. And I'm looking forward to engaging, open to whatever questions you might have.
Thank you so much, Ayanda. And contrary to your opening statement, my only impressions have just been reiterated today: smart, capable, and gracious. Thank you so much for those inputs. I would like to open the floor now to questions and answers. So we have a couple in the chat box, but you are also really welcome to put your hand up and to speak and to ask your question that way. I'm going to kick us off by picking up 3 questions from the chat box and then inviting Katrina and Andrew to respond, and then Garth and Ayanda to respond, and then we'll open up for hands who want to ask questions live. Thank you to Myrtle, who has put 2 links to publications in the chat box. That is really lovely of you. Thank you for contributing that way. Our first question is from Sylvia. She's asking for the presentation. Sylvia, the presentation has just been posted on our website, but if you want to email us directly, we will also make that available. Klaas Mokaba asks, good afternoon, my name is Klaas Mokaba from the DTIC. Can Katrina expand why she said the current cannabis for private purposes bill is harmful? The next question is from Nontlantla Cry. Nontlantla asks, we know that SAPRA has issued a number of medicinal cannabis licenses. Do we perhaps know how many? What is the split between the corporate and traditional growers? How are those growers doing? How did they overcome all of the challenges mentioned by the presenters? And then Zelani asks, what moves are being made to move away from arbitrary THC limits for industrial cannabis or hemp? Certainly, we are acting poorly by sequestering hemp in this way when higher THC leftover biomass can be utilized industrially. And so those are our first 3 questions. So maybe starting with you, Katrina, and then Andrew, and then we'll go to Ayanda and Garth.
Thanks so much, Sherilyn, and thanks to the discussants. I think you've contributed immensely to the kind of richness of the discussion today. So to the question from Klaas, thank you for this question. And I think, you know, when the first draft for the Cannabis for Private Purposes bill came out, there was a lot of criticism also publicly. So a lot of this has been, a lot of what I'll say has been articulated by various advocacy groups and in the media. I think one of the biggest ones is that basically it discriminates against low-income households. So the regulation, as you may know at the moment, is about how many dwellings, how many plants you can have in your dwelling, depending on how many adults you have. And ultimately, you know, that requires a certain amount of land to do. And if we think of where a lot of people in this country live, not many people necessarily have space for up to 4 plants per adult, or 8 if there are 2 adults living in an environment. That automatically, you know, discriminates against households where there are lots of people, or where there is very, very limited space to grow anything really. So I think that's the first point that has been articulated already before. I think the other one that we heard a lot from the people we interviewed in the process was that the way that the kind of process has happened in South Africa around the decriminalization of private use is that it's essentially dropped the market out for traditional growers. And so it's decriminalized use without providing the necessary support to traditional growers in the process. So, I mean, some of the reports we read about kind of the cost of what a kind of a bucket cost, 5 years ago versus after criminalization has been a massive shift and has impacted traditional growers really negatively. And then I think kind of in general, the bill doesn't adequately address, and even when it read in conjunction with the master plan, it doesn't really address the regulatory and legal challenges that we face. And it doesn't go far enough in creating certainty for the economic opportunities that we're discussing here. And I think this is something that's then related to my last point, is that it's simply taking too long. It's taking much longer than it should have. And that is part of the issue is it's harmful for traditional growers, but it's also harmful for kind of our potential for reaching the economic opportunities that have been so spoken about. We've even heard about Matsona. So I think I'll end there and pass over to Andrew. Thanks for the question.
Sure. No, I think Katrina covered it. So I'm happy to move on to other questions.
I just want to check with Garth and Ayanda. Do you want to weigh in on the questions posed so far?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to do that. I think so. The private purposes bill has gone through a number of iterations. The most recent version that we've had sight of actually now includes it still has the challenges around the private use, as Katrina has mentioned, but it does now include the ability for other parts of government to write up legislation for adult use. So that market will open up. And it also does open up an avenue for legal growing based on cultural or religious basis. So it initially used to just focus on the Rastafari community. It's now been expanded. So I think there are also challenges around sort of overreach on privacy and other constitutional provisions under Section 36. So, but I want to touch on the bit around sort of quickly on SAPRA Hamidi licenses. So SAPRA actually makes all of this information available on their website. So you can basically just go on and you'll be able to see all the license holders. I think there are about 80, but I stand corrected on that number. What is the composition of traditional growers? I mean, they almost don't feature at all, in large part because the barriers to entry are really high. So for, in Lesotho, you can pay for a Section D license, and you pay whatever, R500,000 for that, but it doesn't require you to actually build a facility that can then be inspected before you can get the license. So for a traditional grower, now building a facility that has to now meet even the lower sort of, PICS GMP standard, it's just not possible for them to be able to participate. But the producers who are under these Section 22 C&D licenses are also facing quite a number of other challenges. So access to market is a real problem. Part of the issue is, one on SAPRA and the unbelievable bureaucracy there that happens and how long it takes to be able to get permits. But, you have base issues like standards, even for labs, their accreditation, being able to then meet certification requirements, so you can fetch a much greater value if you get your stuff into the EU market that's paying a lot more for the stuff, where it's actually open for the imports of foreign flower. And to be able to do that is there's a lot to be done basically to help these guys out, because if you can't get consistent certificates of analysis, it's very difficult for your market to accept your product. Also, there are a number of challenges even around like the seed side and being able to get propagating materials. So there are quite a number of challenges. And what's happening, for example, is that because you can access a medicine through you can get access to unregistered medicine through Section 21. Folks will go and get and access flower from that, right? So cannabis flower, but a lot of it actually is imported from like Canada and other places. So there isn't like the same kind of access for the local producers to markets that we know actually exist. There are lots of people who are classified at the moment under the sort of adult use or recreational use, where I think the researchers also correctly point out that actually a lot of these people are also using it for palliative care or for medicinal purposes, even though they're sort of usually discounted. But we're still facing the same kinds of challenges. Nobody has really figured out the way. There are loopholes, certain markets where you can take, a product that's GACP certified and then get it into, one of these markets in the EU that allows them to do the rest of the processing of the plant under GMP conditions, and then you would pay like a fee to them, and then you can access like a German market. But it's a long way. You can imagine for a traditional grower trying to get access to like dispensaries or distributors in like Germany. It's a really long way, and there's no support along the way for that. On the THC limit, quickly, our view on the private sector is we've proposed a set of interim measures that can be implemented as incremental steps towards getting the singular bill put together. One of them is really around the THC limits. We continue to face major resistance because the THC limits are arbitrary, they're unscientific, but the insistence of government to continue along with it. The only other option really is to just continue along on the litigation side, both for THC and CBD. So there are some litigation ongoing against the various departments, particularly on that subject. But maybe Garth might talk about some potential advancements in that area, but I hope that's helpful.
Thank you, Ayanda. Garth.
Yeah, according to the SEPRA and DELRED licenses, unless it's changed over the last website, unless it's changed over the last few days, 83 cannabis licenses have been issued and 4 manufacturing licenses have been issued. And so there's enormous anomalies. When you design a licensing and permit regulation, I think you've got to bear in mind that one of the most important or an important outcome will be the capacity and the ease with which you can mine the data which arises from the hemp and cannabis licenses. And I don't think that was taken into account. We need to get permission to mine that data, and there's very often pushback against these things. And one of the anomalies is if companies are allowed to export processed derivatives, and you only have 4 manufacturing licenses, and you've got 83 production licenses, there's a complete and obvious mismatch already, because the capacity in South Africa to process doesn't exist. And even of the 4 manufacturing licenses, my understanding is only that 2 have the capacity to process. So there's an obvious mismatch. And, with due respect, when industrial policy is led by the state in a way where the industrial policy toolbox isn't brought to bear, then you have these mistakes and anomalies. And we've now, as has been said, got massive oversupply and market failures and stranded assets. And then I think 370 hemp permits have been issued in addition to what Ayanda said. I suspect many of those hemp permit holders haven't planted any hemp. The South African, I think they called SA1 and SA2 hemp seeds, which were developed by the ARC, haven't been registered, let alone propagated and distributed. And there are massive problems in relation to the import of hemp seeds. Customs is confiscating a lot of hemp seeds. And so, you know, I'm simply making the point that the capacity of the state across 9 departments and institutions to secure a knowledge base, an information base, regulatory coherence, and efficacy and implementation, as I think speakers have said, is probably the biggest challenge of all. I'm not convinced, finally, and I said I wouldn't comment on the cannabis for private purposes, well, but I think there needs to be a bigger debate on this issue. I'm not a lawyer, half-baked economist, and so whether a constrained mandate from the Constitutional Court will allow in the Cannabis for Private Purposes Bill the kind of regulatory reform that is required, I have very serious reservations about, happy to be corrected. But the critical question for me is to make sure that the CPPB bill doesn't constrain or close any of the doorways to commercialization. And that's something I think that needs to be strongly taken up. Otherwise, I'm covered. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that. Some really valuable insights there. In case anyone hasn't seen it, there are a couple of links posted in the chat box to the SAPRA website where you can update license issuing numbers. Thank you for posting that, Etienne and Zolani. I am going to pose another question. If anybody does still have a question that we haven't yet seen, please feel free to raise your hand, but we've probably got a couple more minutes before we need to close off. This question comes from Daryl Vase. Or Weitz, please excuse my mispronunciation. He says, can Garth or Ayanda give their realistic view of where they believe the industry will stand at year end with regard to legislative reforms and what key actions will be required to make it happen? I had a similar question. In a year's time, what are the crucial things that need to have happened for us to gain traction? Cannabis appears in SONA speeches and is an example of an industry that could realize an entire raft of gains. Where to from here? Sorry, over to you, Garth, and then Ayanda.
I think you're on mute, Garth.
I think one should be cautious with your bets. All I can say as a consultant, the project management office, I'm working night and day to try and achieve urgent regulatory reform, develop an economic evidence base, develop the financing instruments, and so on and so forth. Whether it's going to happen very quickly is a very difficult thing to answer. South Africa actually has a very poor record in sunrise sector development. You only have to look at the 2013-14 efforts to develop a biofuel industry. In the end, it failed, maybe for good reason. Secondly, the renewable energy sector. Given the amount of projected and existing demand for renewable energy, we should actually have a vibrant, at least component manufacturing supply chain for wind and solar. Actually, 5 companies were set up on the back of projected demand under the Renewable Energy Independent Power Producer Program. I think all 5 companies subsequently went belly up. Integrated industrial policy was required, including of the smoothing of demand. The REAP round 3 was cancelled. Demand fell off the table, and all the companies went belly up. I think we have, and I speak under correction, 1 component manufacturer that is a local company in the renewable energy sector space. So we got a bad record, quite frankly, in circumstances where we should be doing the opposite. Manufacturing, the proportion of manufacturing to GDP used to stand at 28% in the, I think it was the mid-80s. It's now down to 12%. I have path dependency, resource extraction, and export dependency, significant problems in relation to the capacity of the state, which often stands in the way of development. I think we've got significant capacity upstream of the farm gate in this sector. I think, as other speakers have said, there's significant production in primary production downstream into the midstream and end user demand space, in addition to the fact that the adult use is by far the biggest demand for cannabis. There are no guarantees. So I'd love, as a consultant, to be able to give a guarantee. If I did, I wouldn't sleep well at night.
Yeah, I mean, not very much to add there. I mean, I think realistically, like a single bill, probably 3 years to get there. It's going to take some time to pull the bits and pieces together, not just on the content side, but I think sort of dealing with government and sort of the allocation of power and oversight responsibilities. I think there'll be a tug of war, and that's already happening now before there is even any kind of bill. So I see potentially some hope for hemp by the end of the year, which is that by the season, we hope that farmers will have gotten access to seed and they can actually plant, and that some markets can be secured. We're hoping for some movement or some major investment in particularly the midstream areas to build up those processing capabilities to help to beneficiate some of the products. I'm hoping for some provinces potentially to actually take more of a leadership role in testing the elasticity of kind of the, these various concurrent functions of government between national and local. And maybe, looking at creating legal sandboxes that allow them to test for certain kinds of models. Maybe that will happen. But in this environment, with all of the virtue signaling from government over the last 3 years, the SONA, frankly, was a little bit embarrassing with regards to cannabis this year. I mean, it's really nothing different to what we've heard since 2019, and there's really been no movement. The only kind of creativity actually comes from civil society and from the private sector. And I'm hoping through these kinds of publications and these engagements, we can also try to leverage a little bit more of the muscle of labor to really tackle some of these issues really head on. But save for that and potentially like mass mobilization of folks, I think it's a long and hard journey, frankly. So we have to sort of brace ourselves and be realistic about what can be achieved.
Thank you for that, Garth and Ayanda. I appreciate the honest, realistic responses. I think we need more of that, honest realism. We are very close to closing now. I wanted to ask Katrina and Andrew if you have some closing comments that you'd like to share in 60 seconds each. before we close? I know that there are a couple of extra questions in the chat box. I'm going to pose those to our speakers directly and ask them to respond on email. So if you'd please share your email address with us, that would be fantastic. I see the question from Etienne van Zyl, outstanding. And if there's anybody else who'd like to do that, please feel free to go ahead. But to closing remarks for you, Andrew and Katrina.
Thanks, Sherilyn, and thank you to everyone here. I guess my closing remarks would really be about kind of the potential that exists within the people in the sector who have a huge amount of experience. There are people on this call like Ayanda, like Myrtle Clark in the chat, who have been in this space in a variety of ways for a really long time, but in kind of different spaces. And I think that knowledge and that information hasn't been properly utilized by the state or brought together. So I think while not trying to underestimate the challenges, I think this is a really exciting space for South Africa to be engaging in, and really exciting that COSATU and Labour is so keen and interested in engaging in the space. So again, just a thank you to everybody, and particularly those who were part of the process.
Thanks. Yeah, I think I'll just echo Katrina with the thanks to everyone that's helped us during the course of the research, the people that gave up their time to be interviewed and talk us through this incredibly complex industry, or industries really. There's so many different aspects to cannabis. I'd also say, yeah, there's such a lot of expertise in civil society and in the various enterprises engaged in cannabis, and hopefully that can be effectively drawn on going forward with the policy processes. Thanks also to Tony, to Garth, and to Ayanda for their comments on the report and for the kind of rich discussion that we've had.
Thank you for that. Our speakers, our researchers, panelists today have been incredible. Thank you for availing your time in really busy schedules and for the exceptional work that you do. It's been a privilege to work with each of you. Thank you. Thank you also to the funders, the ILO and the University of Edinburgh Research Support Fund, and to the IEJ team. I could not do very much at all without the support that you provide. And thank you to you guests today for joining us, for posing questions, and for helping us do the thinking and the implementation work in each of our different roles in the sector. It has been a privilege to be able to share this piece of research work. The cannabis paper should be now posted on our website and available to you publicly. Please feel free to let us know if you have any struggle accessing it. Please feel free to get in touch if you have questions after today that you'd like to pose to the researchers, or to Garth, or to Ayanda, or to Tony. We're happy to mediate and put you in contact with each of those individuals directly. And just to let you know that a related policy brief will be launched in the months ahead. So we will let you know about that as soon as it's publicly available. And just final thanks to everyone for joining us today. Happy Friday. Have a wonderful weekend.